Snow falls in relentless white curtains across the dense pine forests of the Ardennes in January 1945. 25-year-old Private First Class Hank Miller stands beneath the sagging canvas awning of a mobile maintenance unit, a heavy acetylene torch sparking bright blue against a rusted section of steel I-beam. Tucked into the breast pocket of his oil-stained wool shirt is a worn leather welding hood, its dark green glass lens scratched around the brass frame. Outside, 4 feet of fresh powder have choked the narrow logging trails, trapping supply convoys and freezing the advance of Third Army armor near Bastogne. Inside the improvised field shop, Miller wipes grease from his forehead with the back of his leather gauntlet and continues laying down a thick, glowing weld along the steel wedge he has mounted to the bumper of a 3-4-ton Dodge truck. He has spent 18 hours without sleep cutting, shaping and welding discarded I-beams and heavy tank armor plating into a massive V-shaped snowplow. He did not ask permission from division headquarters. He did not submit an engineering requisition form. When a rigid staff captain from Third Army Transport steps into the clearing and demands to know who authorized the permanent modification of government motor equipment, Miller does not extinguish his torch. He flips down his dark glass visor and keeps welding. "Roads are blocked, sir," Miller says, his voice muffled behind the heavy leather shield. "If this plow isn't finished in 20 minutes, nobody moves." The captain's face turns pale with anger as he reaches for his sidearm holster to enforce military order. He does not notice the 3-star general who has just stepped out of an idling command car, his heavy wool overcoat encrusted with frost. He completely ignores General George S. Patton standing 3 paces behind him in the freezing slush. Nearby mechanics freeze in place, holding their wrenches as they look nervously between the private's glowing arc weld and the general's rigid jaw. Patton stands silently in the falling snow while diesel exhaust curls up into the bitter winter air. What happened in the next 30 seconds would reveal the exact line between unauthorized destruction of equipment and battlefield innovation. And the answer was not what anyone in that snowy clearing was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. It helps us bring these forgotten moments of courage and quiet leadership directly to you every single week. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it cost Private First Class Hank Miller to weld scrap iron onto an army vehicle without orders, you need to understand what the Ardennes forest actually was in January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge was being fought in an Arctic nightmare. Temperatures plummeted below zero, freezing engine oil into sludge and turning gravel roads into impassable ice slides. Snowdrifts 4 feet deep filled the narrow mountain passes, bringing entire armored columns to a dead halt. Tanks slid sideways off icy embankments. Supply trucks carrying vital 105mm ammunition and plasma were stranded miles behind the front line in the United States Army. Motor transport regulations were absolute. Military vehicles were standardized government property, subject to strict inspection ledgers. Modifying a vehicle chassis, cutting structural frame rails, or welding unapproved iron scrap onto a lead transport truck was a court-martial offense. An enlisted mechanic who altered government equipment without engineering sign-off faced demotion, financial forfeiture, and time in the stockade. Every mechanic and driver watching from the maintenance shed was making the exact same mental calculation. They knew the consequences of breaking equipment regulations. They knew Patton's legendary insistence on strict military discipline and uniform compliance. They knew that altering an army vehicle in front of Third Army command staff was a fast track to disciplinary action. But the operational stakes along the snow-choked ridges went far beyond quartermaster regulations. The relief of Bastogne was a brutal arithmetic equation written in hours, fuel reserves and frozen riflemen. The tactical math was stark. Every hour, an ammunition convoy remained stuck in a snowdrift. Infantry regiments on the perimeter burned through another 20% of their remaining mortar shells. A 4-hour delay in clearing the forest pass meant isolated units running completely out of food, blood plasma, and anti-tank rockets. Every mile of snow-choked road left unopened carried a measurable cost in wounded men dying of hypothermia and positions overrun by enemy armor. The operational timeline could not afford a single frozen hour, and that was the snowbank Hank Miller stood his ground in. Picture the scene inside that freezing clearing near Bastogne in January 1945. 8 men are gathered around an open-sided canvas maintenance rig, surrounded by 6-foot snowdrifts. The air smells sharply of ozone, burnt iron, diesel fumes, and crisp pine needle frost. A pair of gasoline lanterns hangs from the wooden framing, casting long, jittery shadows across the blood-red sparks showering onto the snow. Through the cloud of grey steam and blue light, Private First Class Hank Miller kneels in the slush, his hands steady on the blowtorch, his body braced against the bitter wind. Standing near the rear axle, Corporal Sam Cooper, a 22-year-old mechanic from Des Moines, froze solid. He was not looking at the steel plow. He was staring at the snowbank, where General George S. Patton stood quietly, 3 paces behind the staff captain. Every driver along the line performed the exact same rapid calculation. They saw an enlisted blacksmith cutting government steel without orders. They saw a general whose temper regarding military discipline was feared across Europe. Everyone braced for the inevitable blast of command fury. Stay with me, because what happened next in that room is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive from that Ardennes logging trail are remarkably consistent in shape. They come from the mechanics and transport drivers who stood frozen in the snow with their wrenches in hand. They all remembered the exact weight of the silence before anyone moved. General Patton did not roar. Not the way a commanding officer reacts to damaged government property, not the way a general looks at an unauthorized modification of military equipment. He looked at Hank Miller's glowing weld and the heavy V-shaped steel plow the way he looked at an armored breach tool. Without saying a single word, Patton took 3 slow steps through the deep snow. He reached out with his leather-gloved hand, tapped his brass-tipped walking stick firmly against the thick steel plow blade, and listened to the solid ring of the iron weld. He looked down at Miller behind his dark glass visor. Then, turning to his stunned transport captain, Patton spoke 2 short sentences. "Mount it on my lead jeep," Patton said, his voice cutting through the wind. "Build 6 more before dawn." Without waiting for a response, the general turned on his heel, climbed back into his command car, and motioned for his driver to pull forward behind the newly plowed trail. In the clearing, the sudden ring of the brass stick against the steel blade echoed through the frozen pines. The staff captain stood motionless, his jaw dropped, watching the general's jeep follow the clearing path. Outside, the steady hum of the Dodge engine filled the quiet woods as the plow bit into the heavy drift. Cooper later recalled that the silence left behind in that clearing was lighter than the air itself. See, what most folks don't realize is that George S. Patton, for all his reputation for strict dress codes and brass polishing, valued practical engineering aggression above all else. He recognized the difference between mindless destruction of property and battlefield ingenuity born of necessity. In that snowbank, Miller was not destroying equipment. He was creating the only key capable of unlocking a frozen supply line. The math in Patton's mind was immediate and precise. Had Patton punished Miller and ordered the plow dismantled, the transport convoy would have remained immobilized for 12 critical hours. A 12-hour delay meant infantrymen freezing in foxholes without ammunition or medical care. To Patton, regulations were designed to facilitate movement, not to immobilize an army in the snow. By ordering the plow mounted on his own escort vehicle, Patton was not waiving military discipline. He was adopting a brilliant frontline field solution and scaling it across his entire command. He transformed himself, in that brief fragment of a minute, from a terrifying disciplinarian into an advocate for frontline practical innovation. He saw a man solving an impossible problem with his bare hands, and he put him to work leading the army. Private First Class Hank Miller was 25 years old, born and raised near the Mississippi River bluffs in Dubuque, Iowa. His father was a county blacksmith who spent 40 years forging plowshares, horseshoe rims, and heavy tractor hitches for local corn farmers. From the time Hank was 10, his father taught him how to read the color of heated steel, how to lay an unbreakable seam with an arc welder, and how to shape raw iron to master any terrain. Before entering the army, Hank worked as a lead welder for a farm machinery manufacturer in Davenport, spending long days building heavy earth-moving equipment. Tucked inside his breast pocket, he carried his worn leather welding hood with its dark green glass lens stamped with his initials, the visor he had used to shape metal since his first day in his father's shop. He was engaged to a girl named Ruth who worked at a local bank, and her letters were filled with talk of spring planting and saving for a small homestead along the river. Hank had a quiet, practical plan. Complete his service, return to Iowa, open his own agricultural repair shop, and never weld armor plate again. He was not a hero. He was the kind of man who looked at a mountain of snow and saw only a piece of iron that needed to be shaped to push it aside. When the snowplow cleared the final 5-mile stretch to Bastogne at 0500 and the first ammunition trucks rolled through the open lane, Corporal Cooper clapped Hank on the shoulder and asked if he realized he had just ordered General Patton's staff out of his way. Hank did not boast. He simply unstrapped his heavy leather welding hood, used his thumb to wipe a layer of black soot off the dark green lens, and placed it back into his breast pocket. He picked up his grease gun to lube the truck's front axle. When Cooper confirmed that the lead convoy was moving at 15 miles an hour through the cleared snow, Hank nodded once, pulled down his cap, and began measuring the next section of steel I-beam. Private First Class Hank Miller survived the Ardennes campaign and the drive into Germany. He returned to Dubuque in the spring of 1946, married Ruth, and ran a successful farm equipment repair business for 35 years. In his shop, mounted above the main workbench beside his original leather welding hood, hung a miniature replica of the V-shaped steel plow he had welded in the snow, a quiet symbol of the night his iron blade cleared the road for an entire army. Looking back at that snow-choked forest trail near Bastogne in January 1945, a fundamental question arises about military leadership. Was General Patton right to endorse an unauthorized modification of army property, or did encouraging field mechanics to bypass standard regulations risk creating chaos across the supply chain? One view argues that rigid adherence to equipment standards is essential to maintain fleet uniformity and prevent dangerous modifications. The other view argues that battlefield victory belongs to commanders who empower frontline personnel to innovate when standard manuals fail against the elements. What do you think? Was Patton's decision a masterclass in practical leadership or an exception to the rules? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us for more untold stories of World War II every week.